Raj, CEO of Galatea, an incredibly successful development services firm in financial services, servicing some of the world's largest banks. Things are going well for you guys. Growth has been exceptional. Why adopt Blitzy?
Yeah, great question. What we are seeing out in the industry is that there's a desire for major financial services firms to cut their time to market down significantly. And I'm going to focus more on that than the cost reduction piece, because I think these market opportunities are fleeting. Our clients are trying to get to market as quickly as possible so they can realize revenue. And in many cases, they are willing to spend the dollars if they can achieve that time to market. And while we've built up a tremendous amount of domain experience over time, the ability to write software and generate software is essentially limited to how quickly even the most talented developer can write code. And what we really see is an opportunity for Blitzy to accelerate that time to market, cut down the time it takes for us to finish software, push it to production, to allow our clients to start engaging in that market, in that opportunity. These big clients are very competitive. Everyone's trying to realize that opportunity as quickly as possible. You have market leaders, then you have the folks that are behind trying to become the next market leader. And that time accelerator is a key facet. And that's where we're really excited about this partnership and I think what we can do together. And, you know, it's going to be amazing.
So you've had some of the very well-known brands across financial services as customers for a very, very long time, right? So you have a unique perspective on what is most important to them, while also being a hands-on Blitzy user yourself. What do you think are going to be some of the most exciting use cases for these financial services firms over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months?
I think it's in two areas. I think one is building out features, building out new services, building out new full stack applications that allow them to realize some of these market opportunities.
Change the bank
Type activities, exactly. And that's going to be tremendous. And I think that's the space we have historically operated in. Why we have these long-term relationships, we can create these strategic changes within the organization in the way that's hard for organizations to do on their own. I think the second area that will impact that first area is the run the bank, which is the operational side. Things like critical vulnerability remediation, things like bug fixes, regulatory items. And I think the interesting thing there is by taking pressure off of that area, that frees up investment dollars to put into that change the bank area. And then allows you to grow faster. Because in the end, you're limited by a fixed pool of dollars that you can invest in technology. And if your run the bank activities are taking up 50, 60% of that spend, that just limits what you can invest in. And at every one of these organizations, they have more ideas than they have dollars to enable those ideas. And I think that's another incredible opportunity. You know, I'm envisioning like this world where imagine you're the information security officer at a major top 5 capital markets firm. You have a list of vulnerabilities you need to remediate. And I'm imagining a world where they click vulnerability 1, 2, 3, and they say, Blitzy, go. And Blitzy goes into all the repos, makes the changes, addresses it, and bang, puts up PRs, and then lets them know, hey, I've done it. That control, right? That automation is tremendous because right now you have risk because it takes time for those vulnerabilities to be remediated. You have dollars. And it's a significant investment to stay on top of those. And it's an ongoing investment. It's not like one of these, I do it once and I'm done. It's an ongoing. And I'm really viewing a world, right, with a Blitzy-enabled world where we can not only shorten that time to remediation, but then free up those dollars to be spent on the fun, exciting stuff, right? Which is to change the bank, which is a lot of the cool stuff that we're working on and that we think that together we can make a huge impact.
I want to double down on something you said, right, where you can go into Blitzy, select a specific mode like fixed security vulnerabilities and trust it to make the changes. I think that approach in particular is something that differentiates us from the rest of the market. And before you made the decision, you evaluated the other tools on the market.
Yeah.
You ran a POC for that. But I think for financial services in particular, right, like given the pace of how fast the industry is changing, like we're at the point where we get new models every 3 months, every 2 to 3 months, right? We have new technologies coming in every 3 or 4 months, right? And given the number of fires and heavy critical operations that you have to run, right, and the number of things competing for your attention, it's really hard to ramp up your workforce and get them up to speed on using and staying ahead of even the latest trends, right? Because every time a new model comes out, the way you prompt it is different.
Yeah.
Like even between Claude 3.7 and 4.0, like a 0.3 version bump, you had to rewrite your prompts.
Yeah.
Because you could no longer be specifically prescriptive, just because Claude 4 Opus, for example, is a very strong reasoning model, right? So Blitzy in particular is special in that regards because you don't need to go iteratively and figure out all of your prompts to get something meaningful, right? You can write a prompt that works really well. You can get back a technical specification that mirrors the system's understanding of what you said, right, across the entire code base, it doesn't matter how big your code base is, which is our specialty. And then once you have that back, you have the confidence that the system understands your intent, right? And you can hit build, and when it gives you a PR, you have a reasonable expectation. You at least know what to expect, right? And over a period of time, we've been doing this for like 3 years now, and we've been able to bump up the quality such that when you get it back, it reflects exactly what was in the tech spec, and we're constantly, moving the needle for what it means for the code quality. So we're looking at, in the short term, delivering code that compiles, if not runs.
Yeah, and I think that is a really important point, right? And I bring it back down to the investment dollars. Do you want to put those investment dollars to convert model upgrades and change the prompt? Because there's the technology cost, but there's the organizational cost as well, right? Exactly what you said. And is that the right place to invest the dollars? Or is the right place to invest the dollars in an amortized manner, because you guys are able to spread those dollars across all of your customers versus one customer having to bear the entirety of that conversion cost, which is, as you said, an ongoing cost. And I think that's what's really, an understated, honestly, point, because there is a narrative. It's like, well, why do we need these third-party code? We can interact with the models ourselves, right? And if you have enough scale, maybe you do that one time, but are you willing to do it over and over and over again as these models evolve? Or do you spend your dollars in your domain expertise, the thing that makes you unique, which is not, how do I engineer prompts for one version of the model versus the other, right? Which is, how do I bring these financial services instruments to market? And how do I realize these opportunities? And I don't think enough, I think that's a very understated value that's so important. So important.
I mean, this is classic theory of the firm: specialize, outsource everything else. But I think there's more to it than just that. I think there's an underappreciation of how hard it is to get this level of orchestration completed. As someone that's just watched Sid do it, you know what I mean? It looks so hard.
Yeah.
So just talk to me about the years of work it took, both from starting all the way back when attention is all you need, right? To plan to build something like this, understanding that inference and compute was going to be the most important thing years before anyone else acknowledged it.
Yep. So I've for context, I've been thinking about this and working on this problem for a very, very long time. So and that's back since 2017, which is really long. Trust me, in AI years. And I was working around that time frame with generative models of the time, which were the GANs and VAEs, various autoencoders, and generative adversarial networks. And the hardest challenge then was to train the model, or to even understand. Training GANs was a really, really hard problem and expensive problem, as training models still hasn't changed. But even then, you didn't have a reliable indicator of how good the model is. The best thing people did in that time was building fake faces, right? But then as progress evolved, I think we took a we made a bet and we stuck to that bet. We were able to look forward and reason back, in the words of HBS professor David Yoffie. We were able to reason back that, as of today, even for financial services, control is super important, right? And we'll talk about control separately. But if you look at how the space is evolving, like, because we want control, we want humans to be in the loop during the entire process, in every single step, right? But the way AI is evolving, right? Between 2 and 10 years from now, we're going to have very, very intelligent models, if not AGI, right? And humans are going to be the bottleneck.
Right.
AI today is the bottleneck just because we don't believe that the quality is up to the mark, so that we can give it enough autonomy such that it can operate in production, right? There's always a human in the loop. Even with us, there's always a human in the loop. But we've built the system such that the human doesn't have to be in the loop, and we can control the amount of human involvement needed so that you can trust the system.
Right.
So a few years from now, when you have Claude 7 or GPT 5 or 10 or whatever, we're positioned to take advantage of those models just because we're already exceeding the limits of the existing models.
Yeah.
Right. So the only way you could have done this, if you saw this was coming a long time ago and you positioned yourself to take advantage such that if Claude 4 is a 5x gain for someone else, it's a 50x gain for Blitzy. And that's the wave we're riding at the moment.
And what's really kind of interesting, and I talked to a lot of our clients about this, which is, do you think at some point the code as an intermediary goes away? Because essentially, the way I think of it is like we're writing a requirements document, a tech spec, it goes into Blitzy, out comes code, then that code goes into a JVM, which then, operates at the machine level.
Right.
Like at some point, do you see this where it's like these models get good enough where we can take away the code as an intermediary and basically go from, a spec into a runtime that's executing?
I totally, and I think, as of today, we're limiting our thinking of agents in the enterprise as like, agent is like a human entity. It does an action. But I think what we're going to quickly see, even if you step back from code a minute and look at like operations, you're going to have agents or AIs more specifically do entire operations, right? And these are operations as simple as customer support or maybe as complicated as payroll processing, right? Things that you can verify, you can detect flaws, you can intercept, and you can have other systems review the work. Classic LLM as a judge, right? In the short term, that's easy to see.
Yeah.
But if you applied that reasoning to the idea that you mentioned, right? Even when we think of Blitzy, like as of today, code is the talk of the town just because it's easily verifiable and it's based very heavily on text.
Yeah.
And multimodal AI and or computer use AI is relatively new, right? So code is like an entry point.
Yeah.
But if you think of how Blitzy is designed and the opportunity in general for the AI solutions out there, the software development lifecycle, like code is a very small part of that process. It starts right over when you communicate, right? In your choice of communication tool and or email. It goes all the way down across various stakeholders to the requirements phase, right? That's how large enterprises work. I can't imagine it would be any different even in financial services. And then when you've aligned on the requirements, all of the regulatory aspects, all of the important designs and architectures and patterns that all the different systems need to work on, you can't really build this on the fly, right? You need to get all that alignment. You need to know what you're building before you build. And that's when you get to generate code.
Yeah.
And even after code, like you can write a ton of code, but you cannot ship it to production. There's a ton of validation and other procedures needed before you can even ship a single line of code in the enterprise.
Yeah.
Right. And Blitzy's vision is to really encompass and cover all of that. As of today, we're operating because we've achieved infinite effective code context. Right. So the idea of infinite effective code context is that you don't need to fill up the context window you need to figure out how to fill the context window, right? If you have a ton of information, we can let the AI figure that out and select the right model to make sure it fits within that context. But going forward, we're expanding that vision to infinite information context, which allows us to integrate more deeply with the other tools out there and bring all of that context into code, right? To give you an example, when an architect or lead engineer is writing a feature, right? Even though you've not told the architect anything about what's down on the roadmap 3 years from now. Like you've had a meeting at some point and you've discussed this. And when they're designing their feature, even if they may not call it explicitly, they're subconsciously at least designing with that roadmap in mind, with the vision of the company in mind, right? It's completely different if you're a hobbyist and building an experiment relative to you're a big enterprise and you're designing something with that vision in mind. So we want the ability for the AI to incorporate that and to explain that. Like this is the reason we made this design choice because you have this small item on your roadmap. And I think when we're at that point, that is when it's game changing, right?
Yeah.
And I think the deeper question that you're getting at is there's more to shipping a product than getting it to run, right? Like we have a very, very clear path to getting products to run autonomously, right? We ship, we iteratively compile, we fix our post-processing to get from the 80% of quantum of work done today to the 100% from a compile time, and then you go into runtime issues, right?
Yeah.
You use computer use, you open up dev tools, you being the agent, they figure out what the runtime issues are, they run the end-to-end tests. Like this is post-processing validation work that Blitzy is perfectly set up to do, right? But there's much more human work. So we are saying, yes, we can do that. However, there are things in the enterprise that will affect the way that you interact with that from a runtime that Blitzy is well positioned to capture, right, and account for. And so it's more than getting a product to run. It is ensuring that we capture all of the work that is happening in the enterprise around that product and getting the right products to run, right? And that's really where this is headed.
Yeah, and I think that's thinking about that full, I call it like TCO, like total cost, right, of ownership. Because you're absolutely right. Writing the code, committing the code is a piece of it. Then you have the entire change management process where you need to file the necessary tickets, get the necessary reviews, produce the necessary documentation. I think one of the things that for me was really exciting about Blitzy is that you've got the tech spec up front. So when you need to produce that as an artifact to go through the governance process to get review, it's already there. Whereas a lot of times now in these enterprises, you're kind of scrambling afterwards to pull that together. Understanding, getting approval for the right to operate, which is the operational documentation. And then I think what's really also fascinating is this ability that once the code is operating and running, to be able to use these models to like diagnose issues when they do come up. Right? Because there are always going to be bumps, data you don't expect, failure modes, that are unanticipated. And then how do you have these AI models also try to understand that? And I think having that full context of understanding that, I think is really powerful and cool because as you said, the experienced engineers and architects have been through several of these iterations, right? So not only do they have an idea of where the organization is headed, where the product roadmap is headed, they've got the experience of the last 10 times they've done this and what were the choke points, what are the problem points, what worked well, what didn't, what are the failure modes, how does the support organization like to operate? And then they feed that back into the code. And it's little things like I've noticed about things like how do you write your logging statements? Certain organizations like their logging statements one way, other organizations like it a different way because the support team, when they're looking at the logs, have different preferences. And it might be depending on where they're based, or it might be the tooling that they have to ingest these logs. And being able to then feed that back as context when you're writing that code is, I think, a really powerful thing because it comes down to like that run the bank, change the bank concept. A lot of these operational things are done through the run the bank budget. And the more people you have there, the fewer people you can have in change the bank, right? And if you can learn from those run the bank opportunities to make that run the bank more and more and more efficient, that allows you to reinvest the dollars. I'm not necessarily seeing the investment in financial services decrease because modern financial services is a technology-driven business. Sure, there's capital, right? You need capital to play in the space, and I'm not taking away from that. But it's my fundamental belief is that it is a technology-driven business, and that's only accelerating. Right? Trading volumes are increasing. Latency sensitivity is decreasing. And so you're always going to be investing because you want to innovate. The question is, how do we enable these firms to invest in the right areas? And I think this idea of looking at that full life cycle, code, the operation, the governance process,
Yeah.
the operations, the product roadmap is such an important facet of it. I'm curious, like, do you think we're 3 years away from that? Do you think, like, where is your head at around the time period for this? And the reason I'm asking is, like, there's also the organizational, like, ability to grok some of these things.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
going to obviously take some time.
Yeah.
Right.
And I'm curious, like, how you see that play out.
I think to be successful, so you mentioned something very important, right? And what you mentioned was that the ability to learn from all of these observations.
Yeah.
So there's two things I want to highlight there. So the reason we designed the Blitzy platform the way it is, like, wait 24 to 48 hours, let us index everything, right? So that positions us for this opportunity. Let us learn from your knowledge base. Today that's code, tomorrow that's about to be more, right? Let us index that and let us process that. From a technology standpoint, if you talk about, do LLMs have the ability to learn new things today at test time? No, right? But there are people there are hacks around it. So OpenAI, for example, and Anthropic have implemented a feature called memories.
Okay.
We have something on our end as well. But what that does is that let's capture these learnings when we identify them across different tools, across the stack, and save them as a reference point, right? So that's the way for you to achieve quote unquote learning today, even with the limitations of today's technology. But it's critical that you build these pipelines, processes, and features today so that when AGI happens, and AGI basically is the ability for LLMs to learn things just like humans do, right?
Got it.
So when you hire an architect today, they know very little about the company, right? What you're headed. They might know a lot about the code, but they haven't learned of how Galatea operates, right? But over a period of time, you can expect the architect to adapt, learn, and evolve beyond their technical knowledge on the specific processes that they're expected to work on. You cannot have the same expectation on today's LLMs, right? That's where AGI comes in. So that's where you have this memory hackers today, but with AGI, you don't need all of that memory. You can expect the models to learn and evolve, right? And there's also methods that I'm seeing in research papers as of today that are moving us towards that. One of those is test time training or test time fine tuning. So we've seen reasoning and or test time inference in a way, you can think about it, which is get the models to explain what they're doing, let them decompose the task into steps, right? And that will help us get a more intelligent answer, because just like a human, if you took multiple stabs at it, multiple attempts, you haven't submitted your paper yet, but you've rewritten it a few times.
Yeah.
So you're able to review your own steps and do a better job, right? So that's what test time inference is. But what if you actually absorb that and learn from that, such that when the next time you wrote such a paper, you get it better at the first attempt? That's AGI.
Got it.
So if you want to achieve AGI-esque features, you can do that today. So there's no question of 3 years. Like, if you really want to benefit from AGI, you need to start doing all of that today.
Right.
But whether we see AGI in 3 years, 5 years, that's like anyone's guess at this point. From the way things are going, I do believe that we no longer need to hope for AGI to come in and solve our problems. Like, the community is figuring out solutions to problems that AGI can solve using techniques available to us today, and adopt the models of today to solve the use cases that we hope they will solve.
I think that's really exciting, because what that tells me is the longer an organization adopts and uses Blitzy, Blitzy gets better for that organization, because it starts to learn the patterns, the nuances, frankly, some of the idiosyncrasies that each organization has, and can start to adopt that into it, just like a human would be, right? Like, the first, we see this all the time, and it's true of our staff as well, is when we first go to a client, we're still learning the nuances of, there's terminology differences, that is important, because that impacts how you write comments, how you name your variables, right? Like something simple like an account structure has different names at different clients. And that means when you're writing code and you have a variable that represents an account, you want to call it, you want to name that variable what that organization calls the account, because that's really important for the next person that comes along. And I think what's really exciting about this is that the model, Blitzy, essentially could learn that over time and start to get that feedback and that refinement, which I think is pretty awesome, because I haven't heard, the other tools out there, Copilot, right? It's not going to start to, and I'm not saying Copilot is a direct analog, but like there are no other tools out there that are doing this kind of thing, which is what I would call organizational memory, understanding how that organization operates.
And really we're achieving the effect of that with really a different approach. And so if you can think about the onboarding guide that Galatea might get in an optimal situation, right, where the enterprise has codified their coding standards in the way that they name their variables, right, you can customize Blitzy, so it will use that as one of its many tools that it will call in and then reflect. But then anytime you get an output, let's say that is not what you had in mind, not the way that you do business, you can then update Blitzy's reference guide on how it's going to leverage and use it. And so without kind of like these self-learning systems, which don't really exist quite yet, you can achieve it by leveraging the human's intelligence to inform the tools to have the Blitzy specific instance for, insert bank, insert service institution.
And I think that's where like our partnership, I think I'm really excited about, right? Because I think together we can start to create these templates, these guides, bring in industry terms into it, right? Like that are very financial services specific and organizational specific, to start to ensure that the code coming out of Blitzy looks just like that organization wrote itself.
We have this funny thing where so there's like 3 orders of approach that Blitzy will take when it's writing code. The first thing it'll do if you give it no guidance is it will match your existing style, right? You unload the code base, it'll mirror that. The second will be will override it, is if you have a organizational memory layer, a system preference that you've expressed. This is our coding guidelines, these are our standards, these are the libraries that we want to use as priority, right? And then the third is if you inside of the prompt, inside of the spec, say, I don't care what I said previously, I want to do it this way, right? And so we go through this hierarchy, and people are like, well, the last thing that I want to do is do anything close to what we've been doing for the last 25 years.
Totally.
So I'll just do the opposite of that. That'll be fantastic.
And just double clicking on that, right? You can even go one step backwards. Like let's say you have an onboarding guide that hasn't been maintained, like a code quality, which is the case in most of the the last thing, like an architect is great at identifying a problem and raising up to management. And I'm an architect, by the way, so I'm not pulling anyone into this. But they don't have the time. Like they rarely prioritize going back all the way back and updating the coding guidelines so that the next person doesn't have the same problem.
Yes.
But what you can do is you can ask Blitzy. You can give your existing document, keep that in GitHub, and ask Blitzy, can you update this document based on the learnings from comments? Like, let's say the architects added comments, like this is the reason why we added this. Or can you create even a coding style guide based on what you see in the code? And I want to use that and give that to my engineers and have them follow it. So you can have Blitzy write the requirements, you can have it write the documentation, you can have it add comments if they're missing right across your entire code base. You can create usage guides that educates the next developer. Okay, how do I get set up and start adding it? By providing a little amount of context that might not be in the code, but letting it figure out the rest from the entire code base.
What you need to do is you need to have like a snarkiness dial. It's like for this code change, dial up the snarkiness. For this one, maybe a little bit more professional.
We'll be calling Grok. We need to get really wild.
Some like wild comments. Then it will really mirror some of the human comments I've seen in code.
That's a good idea.
We joked about this previously, but on our system, on the back end, we can see these massive logs of agents working through problems, right? For large scale pull requests, hundreds of thousands of pages, and it looks a lot like people bickering on Reddit, right? Where it's like, right. You're like, whoa, that's in our Langsmith log, but they end up getting towards the right answer, especially when Anthropic and OpenAI are disagreeing about something. It's like they know it's a rival out there, but ultimately it's the trained data that it's working off of, and it gets to a better result. And the enterprise never needs to see the Reddit bickering to get to the right answer.
And if you think about it, it's quite scientific. Don't get me wrong. Like if you coming back to this point, right? People bickering on Reddit, that's the training data set. If you look at Slack at the enterprise, like even though both teams are part of the same company, they're their incentives, the overall incentives are aligned, but the incentives on the task might be different, right? So you don't always see 100% cooperation.
Yeah, totally.
And especially not on the internet. That's the primary source.
That's true.
So when you motivate agents to adopt that persona and act that way, it surprisingly increases the quality, is what we've seen. So which is what we've subsequently incorporated.
Yeah, that's amazing. It'd be really funny to like have a snippet of those logs that are like that are exposed, so that you can start to see.
We could add that to the UI. Interaction pattern. What it takes behind the scenes.
Exactly. It's the what you see,
right,
and then what it takes. Like the Google picture where they had like the people pushing the car up the hill.
Oh, that's so good.
Those are a few good memes we got.
Right. Yeah, one thing is interesting is that I've been talking to some of our clients about this partnership, and the thing that they seem to really, really get excited about first, and this has been really interesting, right? The first hook is actually around the documentation, the style guides, being able to either utilize and enforce a style guide. It's almost like this idea of, oh, we have a bunch of repos that have been around for a long time that don't follow our latest coding standards. And it's very hard for people to understand. Can you just go in there and fix it? Go ahead and use a new style guide, upgrade the code, or go ahead and add tests, add documentation. And then once that hook is there, then you come in with like the more exciting things. But what's been really interesting is that hook is often the more what I call mundane type activities. And I think it's because the cognitive load is so much on that run the bank side that what they're finding is they can't free up the mind space to think about that change the bank set of activities because they're so just mired in the day-to-day coming out of it. And then there's this idea of like, well, if I can use this to create that breathing room, then I can focus on the things that frankly most people at our clients like to do and are excited by. And then they start to see Blitzy as an enabler for that side of things. But that's been, and I have to admit, that's not what I expected when I started to have these conversations. But it's been really fascinating. And I'm curious if you guys see that across all industries, or is that something I'm seeing in financial services as I'm talking to folks that's unique?
I think financial services and insurance really love this functionality, so much so that we're actually pulling out a separate call to action. Like you can do exactly all of this today, within the flow of Blitzy. But when people, discover this, then they're just using it every time they write code because they basically never have to document again. And so we're pulling it out into code level documentation that is like its own clickable button just to make sure that nobody misses this use case. No onboarding required, and we think that we're going to see probably a significant uptake of these laggard adopters, I would say, that aren't quite there on the large scale code gen, that are just ready to adopt on documentation. That's a nice on ramp, and then they say, well, it's getting all of this correct. You must have the right context.
Exactly.
You can sort of drive it in. So, and it's just something you're really excited about. So you can kind of speak to how this will actually be reflected in the repo.
So I think, it's great to have documentation elsewhere, which is what a lot of companies do. Like I have my docs in Google Docs, or maybe in Microsoft Word or PDF if you're that kind of. But what's most important is, as we operate in an agentic world where you could be using Blitzy, a combination of Blitzy and some other tools, it is super important that you make your code more accessible to the LLMs, right? This is something nobody has ever thought of. Like you thought that you're writing code for the next human, but we're fortunate that writing code, if you write code for the next human, you're probably going to document it better and make it easier for them to understand. And the similar processes apply for agents, right? If a human can understand it, it's because they're reading text, so it's even better than an agent can understand. But it's slightly different in the nuances. Like for example, if you structure your code such that it is, from the parts, it's easy to figure out what the contents are, then that is really helpful for an LLM, right? As opposed to you have folders where you have B nested inside A and C nested inside B.
Right.
So the LLM has to make that many calls to try to figure out what's at the root. And it's not going to be able to look at the top folder and realize that, okay, this is a components folder.
Right.
This is where I can find UI.
Right.
So I think those are some of the nuances that are super important. And the Blitzy platform helps you get into that. So even if you don't use it for code generation and you just use it for documentation, you're great, right? You can give it a prompt like document my entire code base, go into every single folder and add a README for that folder, such that if an agent were to traverse the folder and land on the README, the agent would know exactly what the folder was all about. Right. So
now you imagine a dedicated README on every folder.
Yeah. Oh my God, that would be amazing.
I think that would be like bad because I'd be like, you spent way too much time documenting, but like, you know, it could be done like
totally.
That now.
Yeah. So you're compressing that cost. Like, there's a cost of documenting.
Totally.
Which nobody wants to bear, especially the developers. Right. So you're compressing all of that to like one run. But the best part is, it's not a one-time thing.
Right.
So because Blitzy, you can keep it connected to your repo and it will let you know when there are new changes that it hasn't seen. You can just hit sync and rerun this process and it will update documentation. So every time a new change is made, Blitzy will identify the files, the documentation files that need to change and only update those files and just add deltas to those files. So that by itself is super valuable because even if you had like a dedicated resource, you could have like several full-time resources dedicated to just understanding what changes are being made and how do you want to document them. And you would still be using up their time completely as you scale the code base.
And for any Copilot adopter, right? Copilots are all multi-file now. Like this will increase the efficacy of your Copilot use. So like you've adopted these in the enterprise, you're trying to get the most productivity out of it. It's like hit or miss whether the senior developers are really getting productivity out of it. But like you are setting the conditions when you're making those smaller last mile changes that aren't good to do with Blitzy to get maximal productivity value.
Right. And the reason you should be doing this with Blitzy as opposed to your next best Copilot is because when you're documenting, yes, Copilots are also good at producing like narrow documentation. If you have the patience to iterate through every folder, like good for you. But when you write documentation in particular, every agent is helped when it has context of the entire code base. Nuances from that code base level context that get incorporated to the leaf node folder in your repo. Like that's when you're adding value as opposed to, oh, this folder contains a file and that file has this, right? So when you have that system level view that lets your agent pick one folder and know exactly what's in that folder relative to the entire code base, that's when you're adding value.
And is that because there's these readmes in each level of the hierarchy that's giving the agent the context all the way through?
That's enabled by what Blitzy has built on the back end, right? The fact that we have all of this relational information context across the entire code base. When we are writing that, the documentation will reflect a complete system understanding, right? So you can imagine giving a function to a ChatGPT and asking it to document, and it will give something to you, and it will look somewhat coherent. It's versus giving it to an architect that's built the entire system, their documentation is going to be different. Ours will look, feel, and reflect what the architect with system level knowledge would know.
Yes. And the additional nuance there, to give you an example, the difference is you ask a tool to document this folder, right? And it gives you that this folder contains a button component and that button component has the following properties, etc. Like you have existing tools that are great at doing that. But you have that button and that button is used exactly in 27,514 places. When you have a button, that's possible. But when you have a service, that's probably fewer. That's probably in the tens, right? When you have something bigger, there's like 5 places. But you know what? It's incredibly hard for any Copilot or any system in general to figure out exactly those 5 places that are using this system, right? Especially when you have like a microservices architecture or a split repo architecture.
Totally.
So the value of Blitzy is because it has this infinite code context effectively, and it tracks the dependencies, it can document the places that this service is used. And between having that and not having that, it's worth its weight in gold as an architect.
It's a great point because what we see a lot of, and it's a lot of our projects, are taking monolithic applications and decomposing them into services. And one of the things you lose is when you're in a monolith, the context is really easy to understand because sitting there in that one repo is all the context. You can right click, you can see where the functions are called. And it's easy.
Yeah, right.
You start to decompose these into individually deployable services. And if you put them not in like a module function, but in separate repos, then that context becomes much harder. And if you were on the original team that did the decomposition, or you were an architect who understood how the monolith worked, then you've got all of that information. But if you're coming in new to that, it is very hard. And what we found is tools that are there, like Copilot, like Junie, don't fully understand that big picture, right? They can help you understand this side, but what you don't understand is, well, this API surface looks a certain way because this other module out there that we pulled from the monolith needs to interact with it in a very specific fashion. And I think it's a really exciting opportunity that Blitzy can understand that full picture and allow someone to gain that knowledge who wasn't part of that initial team, because then that allows them to be effective in changing each individual service in a way that's sensible. Because sometimes what we see is that initially that decomposition is done, things are going well. Then you have a year or two go by, and then suddenly this API is changed in a way that maybe makes more sense, but is not compatible or efficient with the way this other service operates. And you don't have that full context. And yes, you might discover it during testing or load testing, but sometimes you just don't catch it until 6 months, 9 months go by, and then it's much harder to clean up. And so I think it's a really exciting thing to be able to leverage Blitzy for that cross-service context. And I'm curious, I think we had talked a little bit about this idea of chatting with your code. And can you talk about how that would help something like this?
I think
that's super cool.
Oh yeah.
Yes. So, you know, we thought about this, like agents are chatting with each other anyway, right? And let's put this in the hand of developers, because chatting with your code, especially like the exact problem you mentioned, like multi-repo context, right? Or looking for something in your code, or having the agent develop a response that really is coherent across and makes sense across the entire code base, right? The ability to do that, we believe, for us, that is very straightforward. We just haven't put it in the UI. We recognize that, and we're building chat with your code base. But it's a lot more than that. So what we're seeing is now happening is that we want to bring Blitzy to where you operate. Like as we expand from infinite code context to infinite information context, right? You're in Slack, and there's a ton of important context in Slack, in that specific Slack channel where you discuss this feature, or that thread, right? Where people gave their inputs. And it's very hard for someone to look at it and figure out what exactly is relevant for the agents working on this task, right? But if you're able to tag Blitzy on that thread and mark that as important, we're able to pull that in when it's relevant, just because we understand it and we've cataloged it and we've indexed it and we've built relationships around it. So when you look back, like chat with your code base is a starting point. Like let's understand more about the code base. We want you to be able to chat with Blitzy and assign it issues or assign it tasks, and have it not just intelligently answer the question, but also call the backend APIs on our end and execute the job for you and give you a link to the PR. That's our vision of where chat can start and where it can ultimately lead to.
Yeah, I think that's tremendous, right? I think that pulling in context from that conversation is such a game changer, because so much of the business context, the nuance, right? We often, as we're working with our teams and our clients, discussing features, discussing new market opportunities, chat captures so much of that information, right? You're going back and forth and you're saying, okay, well, we can model this type of OTC instrument in this way, but if you model it in this other way, here's what it enables, right? If you do it this way, you're going to be limited in certain economic structures. And what happens right now is some of that nuance is lost when it gets distilled into a requirements document or an acceptance criteria, because a lot of our clients are moving to more test-driven development, where acceptance criteria is defined very clearly up front, or feature files are defined up front. And right now, because it's often a human who's taking that conversation and distilling it down into an acceptance criteria, or maybe it's a Cucumber feature test, right, that they're writing. That feature test reflects certain conditions, but may not reflect all of the nuance that was discussed, and almost certainly doesn't represent all of the edge conditions, some of which were probably discussed during the chat.
Which is incredibly frustrating.
Right?
The person that initially started.
Yes.
So.
And I think the challenge is in my mind, is that humans have a limited context window.
Yes.
Right? And that's just the reality. I think it happens to all of us where you've got this chat and maybe this chat's been going on for 5 days. Right? And by the time day 5, you're like, please, for the love of God, I just want to start this feature. And that context is long. It's sometimes got different arcs that the conversation is taking, goes out, comes back together, different threads crisscrossing. And I think it'd be really fascinating to be able to feed that into Blitzy and have Blitzy distill then that down into not only the feature, but the tests to demonstrate that it has understood all of the nuances around that feature, right? Where it's generated all of that and captured it effectively. Because that, I think, is tremendous.
Yes. Raj, can't thank you enough for the convo. We are grateful to have you as a customer, as a partner, and I think now as a friend. So thank you so much for the time, and we're excited to continue to work with you and the entire team.
Yeah, me too. Awesome. I think it's going to be an exciting partnership. I'm really looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thanks, brother.